Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you about some of the world's natural disasters. Each story is about a different disaster, and I've arranged them in order from the fewest fatalities to the highest. The first disaster took place at Dasharath Rangazala Stadium. Around the 1950s, football was becoming increasingly popular in Nepal. To promote and develop the sport across the country, the All Nepal Football Association was established. During that period, the city of Kathmandu was chosen as the site for a stadium called Dasharath Rangasala Stadium. It remains the largest stadium in Nepal and is still the venue for most of the country's major football matches. In 1988, two football clubs faced off in Nepal, Nepal's Janakpur cigarette factory and Bangladesh's Muktijada Sangsad KC. The match took place in Nepal at Dasharath Rangasala Stadium. It was held on March 12th. At the time, there was one major problem with the stadium. When it was originally built, it had only one main entrance and exit. Everyone entered and left the stadium through that single gate. So on the day of the match, every spectator used that entrance. Around 30,000 people attended the game. It was an enormous crowd. Once everyone had taken their seats, the match kicked off at 3 p.m. Not long after the game began, something happened. While the spectators were cheering, they noticed that the sky was becoming much darker as thick clouds rolled in. Strong winds began blowing, followed by rain. It was a clear sign that the weather was turning bad, but things became even worse. People soon realized it wasn't ordinary rain. It was a hailstorm. A hailstorm is when pieces of ice fall from the sky. Being struck by hail is obviously much more dangerous than being caught in normal rain. As a result, panic spread throughout the stadium as soon as the hail began to fall. And as I mentioned earlier, the stadium had only one exit. That made the situation extremely chaotic and dangerous. People rushed toward the stadium gate all at once, pushing and shoving each other. Some people fell to the ground and were trampled by the crowd. There were simply too many people, and in the panic, almost no one was able to pay attention to anyone else. Most of the spectators managed to escape, but afterwards, a horrifying discovery was made. Once the crowd had dispersed and the storm had passed, security personnel returned to inspect the stadium. They found several people lying inside. As they moved closer to the exit gate, they discovered many more victims there. All of them were taken to hospital, but most had already died. The disaster claimed the lives of 93 people. In fact, Nepal often experienced heavy rain during that time of year. However, the weather forecast for the day of the match predicted either no rain or only light showers. As a result, the inaccurate weather forecast is considered to have been one of the factors that contributed to the disaster. After the tragedy, Dasharath Rangasala Stadium was redesigned with additional exits, and better crowd management measures were introduced. The second disaster was the Schoolhouse Blizzard, also known as the Blizzard Schoolhouse. This story is about a 15-year-old boy named Meyer, who lived in the state of Nebraska in the United States. Meyer lived with his parents, an older sister, and two younger brothers. He was especially close to his two younger brothers. All three of them attended the same school, which looked like this. These schools were known as schoolhouses, or one-room schools. Just as the name suggests, they were very small schools that usually had only a single classroom and one teacher. That teacher was responsible for teaching every subject to all of the students. In 1888, around the month of January, the area where Meyer lived was experiencing extremely cold weather. Temperatures ranged from about -10 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius. That was bitterly cold. So every day, Meyer and his two younger brothers wore scarves and heavy coats to keep themselves warm on the way to school. But one morning, the weather was beautiful. There was no snowfall, and fortunately, that was exactly when the students were arriving at school. Although it was still cold, the temperature was warmer than usual that day. On that particular morning, Meyer arrived early with his two younger brothers so they could look at a snowman before class. When it was time for class, at around 2 p.m., Meyer noticed that it had started snowing again outside, even though there had been no snow that morning. Inside the classroom, everyone began to feel colder than usual despite being indoors. At the same time, the wind also started getting stronger. The teacher looked outside, saw how quickly the weather was changing, and announced that school would end early because it had become too cold to continue classes. However, even after dismissing the students early, she advised everyone to stay inside the schoolhouse until the wind died down before heading home. A little later, Meyer told the teacher that he wanted to leave early. After going outside to check the conditions, she allowed Meyer and his two younger brothers to head home. After they had walked some distance, it became very difficult to see where they were going because the wind was blowing fiercely and snow was flying everywhere. They eventually had to make their way through deep snow because it had already accumulated significantly. Walking became extremely difficult, and they could barely see the path ahead. After covering some distance and realizing they were almost home, Meyer immediately led his two younger brothers the rest of the way and called for their parents to open the door. Once they got home, their father lit a bigger fire to help keep the three boys warm. From that moment until nightfall, the snow became even heavier and the wind grew even stronger. By the middle of the night, temperatures had dropped to around -40 degrees Celsius. The next morning, Meyer's family stepped outside and found that the snow had stopped and the wind had finally died down. What Meyer and his brothers did not realize while walking home the previous day was that they had just survived one of the deadliest blizzards in American history. That afternoon, many students lost their lives outside because they were unable to make it home. Many others suffered severe frostbite, causing body tissue to freeze, die, and eventually become gangrenous. These are some illustrations of what the blizzard looked like. It was truly devastating. The storm reached its worst during school hours, leaving many students trapped after they had been dismissed. That is why it became known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard. It received that name because the region affected by the storm had many one-room schoolhouses. Besides Nebraska, the blizzard also affected several other states across the United States. The most dangerous thing about this storm was that it came with almost no warning. As I mentioned earlier, the weather had been beautiful that morning when students went to school. No one knew that just a few hours later, a devastating blizzard would strike. The storm claimed around 235 lives due to hypothermia, frostbite, or being buried beneath the snow. And most of the victims were students because many schools had dismissed their classes just as the blizzard arrived. The third disaster was the Daulatpur Saturia tornado. On April 26, 1989, in Bangladesh, there was a town called Daulatpur. On that day, something truly devastating happened there. People in the area began noticing an unusually warm and humid air mass. Soon afterward, they saw dark clouds gathering overhead. Large flocks of birds suddenly flew away in panic, and the wind began to pick up. Then something terrifying happened. People saw something so frightening that they immediately started running. A massive tornado was heading straight toward them, destroying almost every building in its path and flattening weaker homes. Even large, well-built structures suffered severe damage. This is an illustration of what the tornado looked like. People who witnessed it said it looked like a gigantic black wall. The tornado formed near Daulatpur and traveled about 80 kilometers before reaching the area of Saturia. This is the scale used to measure the intensity of tornadoes. The tornado was estimated to have reached F4 intensity on the Fujita scale. That is an incredibly destructive level. In the areas where the tornado passed, almost no homes were left standing. Many people lost their homes in a single day. Some areas were so completely destroyed that survivors said they looked as if a nuclear explosion had occurred. Those who survived began wandering around searching for their family members. Most had lost their homes, so they had to take shelter wherever they could. Relief organizations provided food, temporary shelter, and medical supplies to the survivors. Later, meteorologists concluded that the tornado likely formed because Bangladesh lies between the Bay of Bengal to the south and the Himalayas to the north. On that day, a mass of warm, humid air moved northward from the Bay of Bengal. At the same time, a mass of cold air moved southward from the Himalayas. The two air masses met over Bangladesh. When they collided, they created the conditions needed for the tornado to form. The tornado became especially powerful because the winds were extremely strong that day. Going back to this image, it was created by AI. Because the tornado was so dangerous, I don't think anyone was able to capture a real photograph of it. And because it traveled from Daulatpur to Saturia, it became known as the Daulatpur-Saturia tornado. Overall, the tornado completely destroyed 20 villages, killed about 1,300 people, and injured more than 12,000 others. However, some studies published later have suggested that the actual death toll may have been closer to 256. So there is still debate over the true number of fatalities, which means it cannot be stated with certainty that this was the deadliest tornado in history. The fourth disaster was the Lake Nyos disaster. In 1986, there was a man named Joseph Enquane. He lived in a village called Subum in Cameroon. On August 22nd of that year, Joseph woke up early in the morning and immediately noticed that everything was unusually quiet. He couldn't hear anything at all, even though he would normally hear people walking through the village and the sounds of livestock. So he looked out the window and saw that there was no one outside. At that moment, he also began feeling a strange tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. He then went back inside the house. When he walked over to his daughter's bed, he realized she was no longer breathing. He became confused and had no idea what was happening. Everything was silent. He felt an unbearable discomfort in his chest, and his daughter had stopped breathing and appeared to have died. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Joseph realized that someone was outside, so he rushed over to answer it. He found that one of his friends had come to check on him. Joseph tried to ask his friend what had happened, but when he opened his mouth, he couldn't speak. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get any words out. Even more strangely, his friend couldn't speak either. Instead, his friend pointed outside, signaling for Joseph to come with him. Although neither of them could speak, they understood each other and went outside together to see what was going on. They soon discovered many livestock lying on the ground. Neither of them understood what had happened. At first, Joseph thought the animals were simply asleep. But as he walked farther into the village, he found many people lying on the ground as well. He then remembered the livestock and realized that they were not sleeping at all. Both the animals and the villagers had died. Joseph continued checking house after house to see whether anyone was still alive. In some homes, there were still a few survivors, including children. Although Joseph still didn't know what had happened, he knew they needed help immediately. So he returned home, got on his motorcycle, and rode off to find assistance. Eventually, he reached another village where several people came outside. Joseph got off his motorcycle and desperately tried to ask for help. But the moment he opened his mouth, he remembered that he still couldn't speak. No matter how hard he tried, no one could understand him. Eventually, people from that village followed him back to Subum. There, they also discovered livestock and villagers lying motionless throughout the area, apparently dead. News of the tragedy quickly spread through newspapers and television, drawing international attention. One of the people who heard about it was the researcher Haraldur Sigurdsson. After learning about the disaster, he believed he already had an idea of what had happened. He knew that near the affected village was a lake called Lake Nyos. Lake Nyos is not an ordinary lake. It is a volcanic crater lake. Volcanoes naturally produce large amounts of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a gas that humans exhale every day, and under normal conditions, it is harmless. However, if someone inhales a very high concentration of carbon dioxide, they may first experience chest tightness, followed by difficulty breathing. More severe exposure can lead to headaches, dizziness, brain damage, and eventually death. Because Lake Nyos sits above a volcanic system, enormous amounts of carbon dioxide had accumulated at the bottom of the lake instead of escaping into the atmosphere. This is believed to have been the cause of the disaster. There was another important detail as well. Survivors reported hearing a very loud explosion the night before the disaster. To this day, no one knows exactly what caused that sound. However, many researchers believe it was directly connected to the disaster in the following way. A massive amount of carbon dioxide had built up at the bottom of Lake Nyos. Then an explosion occurred, although its exact cause remains unknown. It may have been related to volcanic or other geological activity. Most importantly, the explosion is believed to have released the enormous amount of carbon dioxide trapped at the bottom of the lake, sending it to the surface and into the surrounding air. The amount of carbon dioxide released was estimated to be in the millions of tons. As the cloud of gas spread into nearby villages, people and livestock quickly suffocated and died from carbon dioxide exposure. This is one of the photographs showing livestock that died from the carbon dioxide and were left lying across the area. Meanwhile, survivors such as Joseph also suffered carbon dioxide poisoning, making it difficult for them to breathe. That was also the reason they were unable to speak. Fortunately, their condition gradually improved over time. In total, the Lake Nyos disaster claimed the lives of 1,746 people and around 3,500 head of livestock. Afterwards, scientists and rescue teams installed pipes like these at the bottom of the lake. These pipes slowly release carbon dioxide from the bottom of the lake to the surface in a controlled manner. However, even with these measures in place, it is still impossible to remove all of the carbon dioxide trapped beneath the lake. For that reason, scientists continue to warn that another large-scale carbon dioxide release at Lake Nyos remains possible in the future. The fifth disaster was the Vargas Tragedy. This disaster took place in Venezuela, specifically in Vargas State, which is now known as La Guaira State. Many cities in Vargas are located along the coast, making the region a popular destination for beach tourism. Even so, many people in the area still face difficult living conditions. There was a man named Ramon Diaz who lived in the region. When he was younger, around the age of 30, he developed a strong interest in politics because both of his parents cared deeply about politics and had taught him a great deal about it. As a result, he spent much of his life working in politics in the Vargas area. He genuinely cared about the local people and always looked for ways to improve society and make life better for everyone. Eventually, because he had earned the trust of the community, he was elected mayor of the area. Near the end of 1999, one day Ramon and his wife noticed that it was raining unusually heavily. Then, on the afternoon of December 15, 1999, Ramon returned home from work feeling exhausted and went straight to bed. Around midnight, his wife woke him up and told him to look outside the window. When they looked outside, they saw torrential rain, powerful winds, and constant thunder. They even began to feel that staying inside their home was no longer safe. So the couple and their daughter got into their car and left in search of a safer place. As they drove, Ramon often stopped at people's homes to check whether they were safe. He knew this storm was far more dangerous than usual. While he was outside, he received a phone call. It was his assistant, desperately asking for help because their child had become trapped in a mass of mud. Ramon still didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he had to apologize because his own family was also in danger and he couldn't come to help. Just after ending the call, he heard an enormous roar coming from the nearby hillside. When he turned around, he saw a massive wall of mud and debris rushing down from the mountains toward the city. It was moving so fast that he had no time to react. He immediately ran toward the car where his wife and daughter were waiting. But another torrent of mud was already racing toward them from the opposite direction. The three of them were swept away, each in a different direction. That was the moment the disaster reached its peak. Several hours later, things gradually became calmer. Ramon regained consciousness but had no idea where he was. Looking around, he saw collapsed buildings, uprooted trees, and many homes that had been completely destroyed. His first instinct was to search for his wife and daughter. He ran to a nearby house and opened the door to see if anyone was inside. There, he found one of his neighbors calling for help. Soon afterward, they saw a helicopter approaching, and a soldier was lowered down on a rope. That was how they were rescued. Sometime later, Ramon was reunited with his wife. Sadly, his daughter did not survive. At first glance, this disaster may seem like an ordinary rainstorm, but in reality, it was extremely deadly. The main cause was the extraordinary rainfall that Ramon and his wife had noticed earlier. At that time in Vargas, the region normally received about 500 millimeters of rain over an entire year. But during just the 3 days before the disaster, approximately 911 millimeters of rain fell. That was nearly twice the area's average annual rainfall. The enormous amount of rain saturated the soil in the Avila Mountains, part of the Cordillera de la Costa, triggering countless mud flows and landslides that rushed down into the cities below. This is what the mountains looked like beside the residential areas. You can see huge torrents of water mixed with mud and rocks flowing down the mountainsides. Many cities were built directly at the foot of these mountains, making the destruction absolutely devastating. That day, the mountain slopes began collapsing. The rushing water carried trees, rocks, and mud straight into the cities, leaving residents with almost no time to react. This is what remained after the disaster. A few houses were still standing, but most were severely damaged or completely destroyed. As for Ramon, although he survived, he cared deeply about the people in his community and felt that he also shared some responsibility after the disaster. He believed that poor urban planning may have made the consequences even worse. The disaster was named after the place where it occurred and became known as the Vargas Tragedy. The Armero Tragedy claimed the lives of 22,540 people, with many victims dying from hypothermia, suffocation in the volcanic mud flows. The sixth disaster was the Armero Tragedy. Armero was a large town in Tolima Department, Colombia. Most people there made a living by growing rice, and the region produced a significant portion of the country's rice supply. The area also had many other agricultural activities. The reason agriculture flourished there was because Nevado del Ruiz, a volcano about 48 kilometers away, enriched the surrounding land with fertile volcanic soil. On November 13th, 1985, people noticed something falling from the sky that night. They quickly realized it appeared to be volcanic ash. Most residents immediately went inside their homes because they feared something might happen. However, local radio broadcasts assured everyone that there was nothing to worry about. They said it was a normal event and that there was no serious danger. Then, everything changed. Without warning, the town suddenly lost power. At the same time, a tremendous roar came from the direction of the volcano. People rushed outside and were met with a terrifying sight. A massive gray torrent was racing down the mountainside toward the town. People tried to run, but it was too late. The flow was moving incredibly fast and quickly engulfed the entire town. Some people managed to wake up and desperately clung to pieces of debris to stay above the mud. Everything happened in complete chaos, and it all unfolded in the middle of the night. The volcanic mud caused countless open wounds. When the mud entered cuts or got into people's eyes, mouths, or ears, it could cause severe infections. It could also cause suffocation and death. To understand what happened, we need to go back to 1984, about a year before the disaster. Toward the end of that year, many volcanologists noticed that Nevado del Ruiz was showing clear signs of becoming active. They observed that the amount of magma beneath the volcano had increased significantly. At the same time, the volcano was releasing large amounts of sulfur dioxide and other sulfur gases. These were obvious signs that the volcano was becoming active and that the situation was dangerous. The researchers then produced volcanic hazard maps and sent them to government officials. They repeatedly urged the authorities to evacuate the population immediately. However, the evacuation was delayed because many people feared it would severely damage the region's agricultural economy. In fact, just days before the disaster, the Red Cross also contacted the authorities in Armero and continued to recommend an immediate evacuation. But the local government still believed that nothing serious would happen. That continued until the residents heard an enormous explosion. It was the moment Nevado del Ruiz erupted. When the volcano erupted, the greatest danger was not the lava itself, but the enormous volcanic mud flows it produced. These mud flows are known as lahars. They are made up of water, volcanic ash, rocks, soil, and other debris, making them extremely destructive. The following morning, rescue teams arrived at the disaster area. These are some images showing the extent of the destruction. Most of the homes had been completely destroyed. In addition to rescue workers, many journalists and photographers also arrived to document the tragedy. While photographing the scene, they discovered a young girl trapped beneath the rubble. They immediately called for rescuers. But after examining the situation, they realized her condition was extremely serious. Her legs were trapped beneath heavy debris, and without specialized equipment, there was no way to free her safely. A photographer named Frank Fournier took a photograph of the girl. This is that famous photograph. Her name was Armero Sanchez. The photograph later won the World Press Photo of the Year award and became a symbol of the suffering and devastation caused by the disaster. For 3 days, rescue workers continued visiting her, encouraging her and monitoring her condition. But on the 3rd day, she passed away. One of the reasons was that many roads had been destroyed, causing rescue equipment and medical supplies to arrive far too late. There was no faster way to bring the necessary equipment to the scene, and in the end, they were unable to save her. The Armero Tragedy claimed the lives of 22,540 people, with many victims dying from hypothermia, suffocation in the volcanic mud flows, severe infections, or tissue necrosis. The 7th disaster was the 1991 Bangladesh Cyclone. Earlier, I talked about Bangladesh, where a devastating tornado had struck. But only about 2 years later, the country was hit by an even greater disaster. In 1991, there was a 21-year-old man in Bangladesh named Mohammed Kalakwe. He was a young man full of energy. He lived in a village with his parents and his 3 younger siblings. Mohammed's parents were both farmers. His father owned a piece of land where they raised many kinds of livestock, and Mohammed often helped take care of the animals. One day, the family heard a warning on the radio that a powerful cyclone was approaching and that everyone should evacuate to a storm shelter. In many parts of Bangladesh, there are shelters like these. These structures are specifically built to protect people during severe cyclones and storm surges. But there was one problem. Mohammed's home was not close to any cyclone shelter. In fact, his family had already lived through many storms before. They were used to dealing with cyclones, and they had always managed to stay safe. So Mohammed's parents believed their house was strong enough. They thought this storm would probably be like the previous ones, and that they would be safe staying at home instead of going to a shelter. Then came April 29th, 1991, the day the cyclone was forecast to make landfall. That evening, powerful winds began to arrive. Looking outside, Mohammed's family saw trees snapping and falling everywhere. They had never seen winds strong enough to knock down so many trees. Soon afterward, heavy rain began. Then came the most terrifying moment. A massive wall of water suddenly surged into the village. It slammed into Mohammed's house and rushed inside. No one had time to react. The floodwaters quickly swept each family member away. Within moments, the entire family had been carried off in different directions. In just a few minutes, everything turned into a disaster. The area was completely flooded. Mohammed was swept away to a place he didn't even recognize. While being carried by the water, he spotted a coconut tree. He grabbed hold of it and climbed up to escape the flood. All he could do was cling to the tree and wait for the cyclone to pass. By sunrise, conditions had finally begun to calm down. The floodwaters had been extremely deep during the night, but by morning they had started to recede. The scene looked like this. Although the water had gone down, many areas were still flooded. Mohammed remained in the tree until daylight. Once he saw that the water had dropped enough, he climbed down. As he walked through the area, he found countless dead livestock scattered everywhere. As he continued walking, he began seeing more and more people. All of them had died. Later, he found his 3 younger siblings and rushed over, calling out to them. Fortunately, all 3 of them were still alive. But when the 4 siblings reached a pool of water, they found 2 people lying there. They were their father and mother. It was an unimaginable shock, especially because all 4 siblings were still so young. Afterward, the 4 children wandered for several days with almost nothing to eat or drink. Fortunately, rescue teams eventually found them and took them to safety. The cyclone that struck Mohammed's home looked like this from above. The storm was never officially given a name, so it is commonly known as the 1991 Bangladesh Cyclone. It formed on April 24th over the Bay of Bengal, gradually moved inland, and made landfall in Bangladesh about 4 to 5 days later. These are some images showing the destruction left behind. And this represents only a small part of the damage, as many other communities were completely wiped out. That night, countless people survived only by climbing trees or clinging to floating debris. Most of the survivors were people who had reached cyclone shelters before the storm made landfall. Others were rescued later and taken to emergency shelters. As I mentioned earlier, Mohammed had a younger sister. After the disaster, she suffered from severe depression. She refused to go back to school and spent every day sitting beside a pond, remembering her parents. Later, many countries sent food, medicine, and humanitarian aid to Bangladesh. Even so, the destruction left behind by the cyclone was overwhelming. It claimed approximately 138,866 lives and left around 10 million people homeless. It remains one of the deadliest and most destructive cyclone disasters in history. All right. Those were the stories behind some of history's most devastating natural disasters. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you'd like to see more videos about other natural disasters, be sure to leave a comment below. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.